Welcome to the Access Extension Framework Quickstart tutorial. This tutorial aims to give you a look around the framework and just familiarise you with the basic function and structure of the framework. So we've started off here by importing the minimal framework into the single file Northwind database. It gives a fairly minimal setup, and you can see down here the modules that start with XF are all the extension framework modules. Now let's start by having a look at the base extension framework object, which is called XF. So if we hit XF dot, that'll give us a list of a lot of the built-in objects in the framework. Now some of these are libraries. For example, the gen object is a library which contains a whole bunch of functions we can use. Let's just print a Boolean value as a string perhaps. So now that we've had a look at that, let's have a quick look at how the modules in the framework are categorized. So we've got these system modules, and they're the ones that are involved in actually implementing the XF object and some stuff around that. So they're more or less invisible to us. They're just part of the structure of the framework. We've got some objects here that are marked in red. Now they're really designed for use in code. So for example, we can say, if we want to create a data list, they're just used in code as we would use, for example, a built-in record set object in Access. And they're covered pretty extensively in the instruction manual, and there's also a video tutorial on the data list object. So we've got the data lists, we've got a dictionary object here for use in code, a parsargs object which can be used to parse information between different forms, and some caching objects that can be used to cache SQL result sets in a data list. So we've got some internal stuff here as well. You can see the DB schema objects are used to cache the schema of the database in memory. We've got a linker object and a scripter object, and they both support the linking and scripting functions of the control center. So a lot of this stuff is internal to the framework. You can use it through the control center, and it just sort of is accessed automatically as part of the other functions of the framework. You can use these if you want to, but they're fairly advanced objects, so they're probably not for the average programmer to use. And that leaves us with the library objects. So we can see some of the different libraries we've got here. The controls library is related to controls on the screen, so there's a whole bunch of different functions here that we can use. Some very useful ones. For example, this one selects the first value of a combo or list box if there's only a single row in the list box. If you want a list of all these, there is a comprehensive reference on the website. So here's the website. You can see here we've got a list of all the different libraries, all the different objects in fact, and for each of those we can drill down and have a look at all the different categories of function within them. There's an alphabetical list of methods, and then we can drill right down to a description of each function, which has got examples and call templates and so forth. So the interact library is all about interacting with the user or between external objects to the database. Again, we've got a whole bunch of different stuff in there, and that's all summarized on the website in the reference. We've got things like writing and storing blobs, that's binary objects to the database. We've got safe versions of a lot of things. So, for example, with forms or reports, they often throw errors in particular situations, and these versions are the same as the open form and open report actions, but they'll trap the error. We've got file dialogues, HTML encoding. We've got ASCII encoding and decoding functions, and so on and so forth. The string functions are worth mentioning. So we've got two sets of string modules. str is the case insensitive string functions, and strcs is the case sensitive ones. So the modules are identical, except that With string functions in Access, some of them allow us to specify case sensitivity as a parameter in the function, but a lot of them don't, and whether they are case sensitive or not actually depends on the option compare parameter of the module that they reside in. So what we've done here is provide two modules, one with option compare binary, which is the case sensitive one, and one with option compare text, which is case insensitive. But in every other way, these modules are identical, so you basically have the choice, depending which library you use, as to whether it's going to be case sensitive or not. And the string libraries contain a whole bunch of different string functions. They contain most of the functions that are present in Java or .NET, such as starts with. We've got a starts and ends with, so you can check those out on the website as well. So the final thing to cover is the external modules. Now there's two of these. They're not covered under the copyright. Most of the extension framework is proprietary, but these have all been downloaded off the web at various points. We've tried to keep the attribution to the original authors, and any copyright notices are still in there. So this is a collection of different bits and pieces that are extremely useful in Access. For example, we've got a system sleep function, we've got open, the famous open and save file dialog, the browse folder dialogs, external shell launching, print dialogs, create GUIDs. There's a whole bunch of useful stuff in here that is usually the kind of thing that gets cut and pasted off the internet, but what we found was that after the advent of 64-bit, it was extremely hard to find 64-bit compatible code, and we actually had to do a lot of patching to get it to work. So this is similar to the string modules. This is two identical modules. One of them only supports 32-bit, the other supports 32 or 64-bit. And there's some compiler constants here at the start that switch in or out each of these modules. So you should import them both in, and then the correct one will be selected depending on which version of Access you've got. I suppose you could delete this 32-bit one if you're only ever using Access 2007 onwards, but leaving both the modules automatically switches. So if your application does get run on an earlier version of Access at some point, it'll just automatically switch to the older version. So we've more or less covered the minimal configuration. It's time to move on to the standard configuration. So here we've loaded the standard version of the framework into the split front-end back-end Northwind database, and this sort of gives your normal scenario for a front-end back-end pair. So you can see here we've got some local extension framework tables. There's a few linked extension framework tables that live in the back end. We've got a few forms, and we've also got all those modules that we had before, plus a couple of extras. We've also got some sample modules here because we've chosen to import the sample code. Okay, so let's hit Control G and have a look at the command function of the framework. So this is sort of like the control center, except that we can run various application commands from here. For example, we can print out the application version. We can print out the framework version. We can relink all the tables if we want. We can show the information on the tables in the database. So you can see that's just a handy little way of invoking some of those commands without having to actually fire up the control center. And there's a handy, in the XF object, there's also a handy shortcut to the control center, xf.cc. Opens up the control center form for us. This is the control center which you get in the standard version of the framework. And this has got a whole bunch of different settings to do with the framework. This is information, different preferences for the way the framework updates and so on. We've got a scripting generator. We've got a script editor, a script executor, some diagnostic functions. we've got a fully featured table linker, which allows you to specify the tables and the database information, and linker search paths for searching for particular databases on the network when the links break. And we've got an error log. There's a control center tutorial, so there's a lot more detail in that. So this middle part of the tutorial is about exposing the functions in the framework to the global namespace. Now, before we start, let's just create a module. So this is a normal code module in Access. I'm going to call this one app specific. I usually create a module with that name just to put some miscellaneous stuff that's specific to this particular database. And I'm going to use a pre-prepared function. This is a pretty simple function. It just takes a parameter and then returns it with O-matic appended to the end. So you'll notice this is a global code module and it's a public function, and that's the key thing here. So what we're going to do is go up to a query. I've created a very simple query here. Query 1, it's just a few fields from the customer table, and we'll paste that in here. Alright, so what happens when we run that query? This is one of the neat features of Access. One of the reasons that makes it popular and good is that you can embed VBA functions within your queries if you like. So what that does is run off here. It finds this function, which is in a global module. It's a public function, so it can access it. Now, we can do other things as well. For example, say we want to use one of the framework functions. We can wrap that in here like this. So this is from the general library, and there's a make text vertical function. Let's go back and run this again. And you can see this time it's printing that vertically down the record. So we're using a framework function here. And you might think, okay, why don't we just cut out the middleman here? Let's go direct to this function. So in theory, this should work the same. But what you'll find is you get the undefined function error. So the problem here is that the framework embeds this object chain. So there's a few different objects that we sort of have to call here in order to get the make text vertical function. And the query parser isn't able to recognize that. It basically just confuses it. So really, if we want to use framework functions, we're restricted to having them available as public functions directly in global modules. And most of the framework is hidden away in these class modules. So class modules are treated a little bit differently by Visual Basic. Whereas a normal module is available in the global scope all the time, the class module really needs to be declared before it's available. It's like a built-in class, for example, a record set. You actually need to declare it in code before it exists. And that's handy for sort of hiding it, so that keeps it out of the way and stops it cluttering up our namespace and colliding with any other functions we might have that already have those names. But the problem comes when we want to use that in the more global namespace. So the way we've dealt with that for the basic access functions is actually in base instance here. Basically all these functions you can see are just wrapper functions. So we've got a return rec function that takes these things. All it really does is just directly call that function within the framework with the same parameters. So this is what we call a wrapper function. It doesn't really add anything, but all it does is allow us to expose these functions on a global scope. So there's a few choice functions from the framework there. There's the error processing function, some of the global value functions, we'll cover them in a minute. Return rec just allows us to pass some SQL and return a value similar to DLOOKUP from the database, but it just takes a SQL string rather than specifying different parameters like DLOOKUP. We've got this function MT that's used in a lot of places to choose empty values. It's a little bit quirky. It's sort of in the spirit of the NZ function, a very short, very commonly used function. And also the name empty and isEmpty are taken in Visual Basic by system functions already. So this is a framework function that's a lot more flexible. And it just simply determines if a variable is empty or not. So because of these wrapper functions, we can use empty, and any of these other functions at the global level. So that includes within control sources, within forms or reports, and in SQL as well. We've got some other useful ones. Q is a function that quotes a string. So that puts single quotes around it. DQ double quotes it. And it also escapes characters. So for example, if there is already a single quote in a string, then it will escape that for us when it prints it. And if we use this before inserting stuff in SQL, this will protect against SQL injection attacks. We've got a few other functions. NZE is like NZ, except that it also uses the alternate value if it's empty, not just if it's null. There's a substitution thing, which is a little bit like the formatting function in Java or .NET or C. A function to truncate the date-only part of a date rather than the date and the time, including one that'll take a variant argument, the time-only part. So these are the few things that are exposed to the public scope from the framework, but if you want to, you can expose more. I'd recommend making up an app-specific module, and you can go ahead and you can create a function called makeTextVertical that takes an S, and you just point that at the framework makeTextVertical function, and then here we have it. Okay, so there's some built-in framework functions that we should cover. When you're going to use the framework for doing things like table linking and automatic upgrading, it's important that you run an auto start function that sort of just checks a few things that the framework needs to keep monitoring whenever you start up your application. Now that lives in, of course, the XF object. It's the auto start function. That's what you need to do at the start of your application when your application opens. But of course that's in the XF framework, so that's not actually exposed to public scope at the moment. So what I normally do is create a function auto start, actually a sub auto start, and we can just put that in here. And you can actually call xf.autostart direct from your code if you're using a splash screen, which a lot of people do now. Or if you need to use a macro, an auto start macro is the simplest way of automatically running some code when the database starts up. But the macro is quite similar to SQL and the control sources in that it only reads the global scope. So we actually need to provide a wrapper for auto start if we're going to put that in a macro. So let's have a look what Northwind does on startup. It's got this startup form that's automatically opened when the database starts. We'll notice the onOpen event here is actually from the code window. It's a code module called startup. So the easiest way to do this is just at the start of all this, add the XF auto start function in. Alright, and then we'll try reopening this and see what happens. Okay. So that dovetails in quite nicely there. And that's the idea, that the framework just does its thing. It keeps an eye on what it needs to keep an eye on, and then just fades into the background. So that's the startup function. There's also an error handler that you may have noticed in the base instance module. So the framework has built-in error logging, which means it logs errors to either a local or a shared error log table, depending on whether the backend is available. And in order to do that, you need to call this process error function when an error occurs. So you'll notice throughout the database, we use that at the end. So this is kind of your standard template for a property. On error, go to proc error, and then when we've got proc error, we call the process error function with the error number, the description. I usually put this module name parameter at the front of every module, so it passes in the name of the module and then the name of the actual property or function that this is. So that gives us error logging, tells us where the error occurred, when it occurred, and it gives us the error message. So finally, I'll cover the global value objects. We saw a minute ago how you can use functions in your SQL queries. That's basically what we do with this set of global value functions. Now, the instruction manual covers all the different reasons why this is the best way to do it. There are other ways people use, such as a global table that stores key values. You can also use direct references to forms or reports, but there's various reasons why using a set of global VB values is actually a lot more flexible and probably a lot safer in general in terms of errors. So I'll just show you quickly how to use those. Let's presume for a minute here that what we want to do is return a particular country from this query. So say we want to return all the results from Germany. Now, as we said, one way might be to do a form reference, but the way we're going to use here is the way that the extension framework supports. And we can add to a list of global values. First of all, we've got a group name, so we can separate them into different groups if we like. We can have different lists of values, each with a different group name. That means we can repeat values if need be. It's sort of, again, like a name spacing function, so we don't have collisions between different similarly named items. If you leave that as blank, then it just goes into a default global group. So let's call this country, and then we'll pass a value of Germany. Oh, we don't actually need the bracket there. So that's added to our global list. We can print that value if we want. Okay, and there's also a no error version you might have noticed. Let's go have a look at that. So global value no error grabs that value, but if it so happens that it hasn't been defined yet, global val will actually throw an error. So it can return a null value. You can actually set this to null if you want, and that's fine. And global val will then return a null value. But if this hasn't even been set, if there actually is no value called country in the list, then global val will return an error. So we've got this optional one called global val no error, and it's often handy to use that in case when you're doing debugging, for example, perhaps that query might be opened up without having gone through the screen which sets the global value. And rather than throwing errors, it's nice if you can just use, say, an NZ to cast that to something sane, and then we don't have to worry about those ugly errors coming up. Okay, and one last thing to notice is that we've actually exposed the global value function as global functions. We've made a wrapper for them, so we can actually use these values in the places we talked about before in SQL queries and so on. So let's cut and paste this in. And we'll see how this runs. Perfect. So that's just a handy thing that's available. Again, more details in the instruction manual. Now, as the very last part, I just want to go over some of the tables in the framework and what they actually do, and the forms. So we've sort of been over all the modules at the beginning of this tutorial. So I just want to quickly cover what these tables are. So these are all the local tables in the framework. The DBID, that's the front-end database ID table. This is where it keeps all those values we enter when we set up the framework. Now the dummy table just simply has one record and one field, and that's handy when you're trying to, for example, select some values. And in some versions of database system, you can just select a value in SQL and it'll return that. But in Access, you actually need to reference a table with a from clause. So the dummy table here is just available for you to reference in a from clause. Obviously the problem is if the table has more than one record, then you'll return multiple rows. So this dummy table is guaranteed to only have one record. The local error log table, that's where errors get logged to locally if the backend's not available, and then on startup the local error log is written to the shared error log if it's available. These three tables are where the linked table manager configuration is stored. Temp assign is just a handy table that's used for assigning one-to-many relationships in the database, and that's normally used as backing for a form. The text container table is where all the text scripts from the control center are stored. So that's basically just an arbitrary place to store long pieces of text, such as these scripts. And this is the local configuration, which is also all accessible through the control center. And then we've got a few shared tables at the end here. So this is the shared error log, where all the error logs end up. This is the shared search paths for the table linker. And we've got a configuration shared, which again is all available through the control center. We've got a few forms as well. Mostly these are sample forms, which come in as examples of various functions. But the control center has a few associated forms. We've got a dialog form that the control center uses, and a form used for browsing to an external database and getting a path for the linker. So the last thing we wanted to cover was upgrading the framework. There's a handy little function here, so let's go back and remember that there's a command object within the framework, And we can just remove the whole framework from here if we like. Gives us a few confirmations so we don't accidentally muck everything up. And let's go back here and have a look. So you'll notice that everything with an XF prefix, including all the tables, every object from the framework basically has been removed, apart from these sample forms. It doesn't remove the sample forms. You can manually remove them if you want. And then to import the framework again, you just simply need to go back to square one and import the framework like you normally do using the setup form. And that's the end of the Quickstart tutorial.